And what you're seeing here is the following. This is the percentage of the vote given to Bush in 2000. And what you see is, and this is basically the degree of pro-white bias on our test. What you're seeing is, as pro-white bias increases, so does voting for Bush. Okay? So what we would never say from this is that this says anything to us about George Bush's level of prejudice or even about the particular individuals involved. But what we're saying is that there's something about that congressional district that shows this association. Higher the level of bias across all of those people, the higher the likelihood that that district went to Bush over Kerry. And the four that I'm showing you are interesting because 2 slides are the 2000 election, the other 2 slides are the 2004. So think of that as just a replication. We get exactly the same data twice in 2 elections. But the difference is that the first 2 slides, and I'll just go back, these are the first 2 slides, they look identical, 2 different elections, are also the same as what happens when you simply ask people how they feel. Forget the IAT. You don't need the IAT to measure degree of race bias. You can just say, how much do you hate people who are black? Okay? Or how much do you love people who are like your own or white? You can simply ask that question and plot this, and you see exactly the same kind of effect. In other words, and I think in opposition to what somebody like Rush Limbaugh was saying, people with higher levels of bias are willing to actually state them. It's not something that you need some implicit indirect measure to pull out. You're finding it on exactly what they tell us on their own self-report measures. So I'm just going to, all right, so a few more slides that will just tell us about the sorts of data that we see showing this difference, where conservatives seem to be showing larger levels of the effect, whatever that bias might be, compared to liberals, on white Americans compared to African Americans. Certainly, these are all on implicit measures. So if you just run through this list, I won't even read it off, you'll see that it's in sort of the expected direction with higher liking of those who come from one's own group or from the dominant group, let's say. In this case, I'm willing to say that. Do exactly the same thing with the explicit measures, and you see pretty much the same thing. A couple fell off, so that on the explicit measures you don't see it, whereas you do on the implicit, but it's really pretty much the same. So conservatism is associated with expressed bias towards groups that are disadvantaged, and that's both conscious and unconscious. In a paper that we wrote a few years ago, John Jost and Brian and I looked at 10 years worth of work on an idea that John has been doing a lot of very interesting work with called system justification. The idea here being that we're familiar with the notion that individuals will do things to protect themselves compared to another. So ego protection theories are all over the place, okay? But then some social psychologists went beyond that and they said, people may not necessarily only protect themselves. In fact, we're willing to sometimes cause harm to ourselves in order to support the larger group. These are group justification theories, like social identity theory and so on, where the protection of the group is even more important, perhaps, than the protection of the individual. And we argued that there might be a third level, a level where you don't just care to support your own group, but the larger system. So system justifying forces is what we were looking for, and we came up with a bunch of hypotheses, in this case 20 of them, to test, to see if indeed you could see the counterintuitive result that members of disadvantaged groups would actually harm their own groups in the interest of supporting the larger system. And again, I will just walk you through the crucial part here. If you take something like a Gaystraight test, on which we're measuring attitudes towards these two groups, look at the data from people who are all straight in this case, so they've expressed that that's their sexual orientation, and let's look at what happens as a function of conservatism, okay? It strongly predicts, as you would expect, okay, a pro-straight anti-gay bias, both on the implicit measure and on the explicit measure, and these are large enough n's that we are confident in some of these estimates. The other group is the interesting one. This is the group of people who say that they're gay, lesbian, and if we now look at the liberal conservative dimension among them, what you're seeing is this kind of group underserving bias, such that the greater the conservatism among this group, the more pro-straight an attitude they themselves are revealing, okay? And you see this in many other kinds of groups. I'm just gonna, I have 2 minutes now. Okay, so let's see. So this, if asked the question later, I will tell you about data that show that where liberals were 30 years ago, conservatives are now. Okay? And so this question of, when we look at the future, so this is again an analysis that actually John and Brian have done, looking at so it turns out that liberals haven't varied much in their expressions of attitudes towards black Americans over a 30-year period. So they're roughly where they were in 72, they are now. But conservatives have changed dramatically from expressing a warmth of 56 to a warmth of 70 on this scale. So there's a big movement. And so one way in which we can look at these data is to say that conservatives will be where liberals are. And that's something that we can talk about as we get to those questions of ideology. I'm going to just tell you that we've been looking at something that I think might be of interest to you. We've been looking at how does a human being mentalize what goes on in the mind of another. Okay? That was the basic question. And Jason Mitchell is the lead on all of this work and has just done some of the most beautiful work on this topic. He's clearly the person who deserves all the credit. Let me just tell you about a single study that we did, back to showing how liberals can be biased here. Harvard undergraduates look at a person's face and read a description of the person. Quite simply, the person is described as being slightly left of center, upset that Bush managed to get reelected. That's all they know about the person. There's really very little that they know other than that he seems to be a college student here. This other cute-looking guy is somebody who identifies himself as a fundamentalist Christian. He's at a different campus and a Republican. Okay? That's all they know. And then they're asked to make wild predictions about what these people are likely to do in the future on a variety of absolutely inane activities, like what's the likelihood he'll step on his girlfriend's toes when they're dancing, how often do you think he does his laundry, what kind of career do you think he's going to want, and so on. And you try to predict based on these things. People do this, okay? Except that we put them in a magnet while they're doing this. So while they've read the descriptions outside the magnet, while they're doing this task of telling us how likely this person is to worry about getting a good summer job or how often he does his laundry, we are measuring what their brain is doing. And I'm going to again simplify the data by saying there is something called the medial prefrontal cortex. This is this region here. By and large, we have mainly focused on this region as a whole, showing that when we think about what goes on in the mind of another person, this region seems to be active. Okay? And it's an interesting thing that when you try to think about what goes on in the mind of a cat or a dog or a computer, this region is not involved, nor is it involved when you have to learn factual information about a human being. So it seems to be this confluence of thinking about a relevant other, an agentic other whose views can have impact on you, perhaps, and that's where this area seems to be involved. And what we saw in this study for the first time is a split off, depending on who you were thinking about. Okay, the person who was the conservative Christian versus the social democrat like yourself, this region, the little blue one, is the region whose neurons are being used when you think about the person who is like yourself, the social democrat. Okay? This big region is the region that seems to be involved when you think about the person who is the fundamentalist Christian. Not on dimensions that have to do with ideology, but dimensions that have to do with simple things like how often do you think he does his laundry? Okay? We are separating in some way, and so I'm going to go back to those moral dilemmas that have become the vogue, talking about what's going to happen to this trolley that's going down a path and it's going to kill 5 people, and should the driver switch in order to kill 1 and save the 5? And we say, yes, 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 save the 5 and take the life of the 1. We don't do the same when we're asked if somebody should get pushed over a bridge so that he can get killed while 5 others can be saved. Turns out that when we're asked that question about chimpanzees, should you shove a chimpanzee to save the 5 chimpanzees, many more of us say, yeah. We become utilitarian when it comes to a question of a species that's very different from us. And I'm just going to put this all together and to say when we think about ideology, especially the mind of the judge, so when Judge Roberts says that the goal of justice is to be like an umpire, I think we might want to show him this little picture and just bring up the possibility of how one might not only not be an umpire, but never know that one is not being an umpire. And I think I've taken too much of my time. So the study on Bayesian racism, which is one that I'm quite interested in talking to you about, I'm going to put aside for now and just tell you that yes, when we are thinking about donating organs, we do think about people who are like ourselves. This guy's organ donor card specifies for any deserving conservative. And with that, I'm going to end and let Brian take over.